Hello, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremando for YogaUOnline, and I'm here with Dr. Emily Splichal, who's a podiatrist and trained foot surgeon, but she made the decision a while ago to turn her attention and considerable skills away from practicing surgery in favor of working with her patients in the realm of functional and regenerative medicine. She's especially interested in the role of anti-aging science as it relates to movement longevity, which if you've spent any time at all here at YogaU, you know is a major theme of our community. So we're super excited to have Dr. Emily here with a keen eye for movement dysfunction and neuromuscular control. Dr. Emily is a leader in the area, which you may or may not be familiar with, of barefoot science. She's the author of the book, Barefoot Strong, Unlock the Secrets of Movement Longevity. And in addition to her clinical work with patients, she teaches classes and workshops throughout the world in barefoot training, postural alignment. I'm probably missing something there, but welcome, Dr. Emily.
Of course. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure and honor.
Now, one thing I need to say is that to spend any time at all listening to you or reading your work or watching your videos is to realize that although you're trained as a podiatrist, it's not just about the feet. So as yogis, I think we do recognize the role of the feet. You know, we talk about the feet as the foundation of the pose, and we got to have this part of the foot on the floor and all that. And of course, we're cognizant of the role of the foot as the primary vehicle of bipedal locomotor movements like walking. But in fact, I think as yogis, one thing we don't always recognize is the pivotal role of the feet as translator between the earth and our bodies. And toward that end, the foot is a key player in things like stabilization, proprioception, functional movement, sensory input, alignment, posture, energy, and force transfer, of course, gait, even having a role in the health of our pelvic floor and respiratory diaphragm. Now, you've spent considerable time informing, teaching, demonstrating these roles to parents, teachers, patients, yogis, trainers, you name it. I wonder if we might start by you just talking about the most important role of the foot that we're not always aware of. So some of the things that our feet are doing while we're not paying attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I teach about the feet, again, whether it's a patient or a professional, is that I really like to build an appreciation for the complex integrated function of the human foot. And this is done biomechanically, fascially, and sensorially. Now, the biomechanical one is probably the easiest for people to appreciate, because if someone has fallen arches or flat feet, just like the foundation of a building, the rest of our postural foundation will be impacted by that loss of stability in the foot posture or in the foundation. So any inward pronation, rotation of the foot translates up the chain. And this is where I demonstrate to patients or professionals that just a subtle unlock of the foot can unlock the entire lower extremity into the pelvis, which then makes it difficult to engage the glutes, the deep core, the rest of our stabilizers. And then, of course, that can translate all the way up into the neck and into the hands. The other way that I like to look at the foot is fascially, and there's many powerful fascial lines that run from the bottom of the foot that are integrated into how we stabilize our feet and our core. A lot of those are following anatomy trained fascial lines. And then the last one is sensorially. And that is based off of the skin in the bottom of the foot having thousands of nerves. And every single time your foot contacts the ground, your nerves are designed to read and react to every step. So we have to have a dynamic engagement with every step that we're taking so that the body can interpret that and adjust the way that you're moving to then optimize foot core stabilization. So really powerful. And again, I try to get people to understand that it is biomechanical, fascial, and sensorial in its function, where the ultimate goal is, as you had mentioned, is really bipedalism. And our feet, our skeleton, our myofascial system is designed to move. And that most functional movement that we do every day is, of course, walking. So we have to understand how to stabilize, how to transfer energy, and that is deeply integrated in the foot and where your center of gravity sits, which is your pelvis. And there's really powerful connections.
You mentioned the fascial net. Do you mind talking a little bit more about the foot? Because again, I don't know that people understand that it's kind of a prime piece of the total body net fascially.
Yeah,
and
so we
also as a
actually,
communicator, right?
it is, and it is, you could see it as one of the initial triggers to myofascial stabilization. So what ultimately is triggering the body to stabilize dynamically is our relationship to gravity. And gravity, I often explain, as this weight on our shoulders, but it's also a proprioceptive hug. So our awareness and our connection and a symbiotic relationship with gravity is necessary to optimizing movement. The way that our foot relates to gravity is in relation to the ground. So how the foot and the ground interact or dance together is ground reaction forces. So every foot contact, you experience ground reaction forces, which is really gravity. And then that is your body's energy. But the only way that you can utilize that energy is if you system-wide stabilize, and this is very integrative and very fast that this is occurring. So they're along these fascial slings or this fascial web. In different workshops I give, I often explain that fascial connections in the human body are fast. So if you stabilize your body fascially, you are essentially stabilizing very quickly. People who try to move muscularly or stabilize muscularly, they're not as optimized or efficient. That's actually where a lot of injuries occur within the body. So optimal movement patterns are based along these fascial connections. Now, having said that, a lot of these lines cross the bottom of the foot. So just one example, your deep front fascial line, which includes your posterior tibialis, and it runs from your post tib and your long flexors into your pelvic floor and your diaphragm, all the way up to your tongue, is connecting to your peroneus longus on the bottom of the foot. So you have two tendons that make up several fascial lines that are inserting onto each other. Now, for those that are familiar with the fascial lines, your peroneus longus makes up both your lateral line and your spiral line. So if you think of those two fascial lines during locomotion, well, our lateral line is going to stabilize your single leg as you transfer into mid stance, right? Activating the glutes so that your pelvis is stable. Your spiral line is coming into your obliques, into your serratus anterior. So think of the rotation of the T-spine, but then take it even further to athletic movements and think like a pitcher, like someone throwing a ball is a really key spiral line activation. So that connection of a deep line to a superficial line, two superficial lines, is really just a demonstration of the integrated nature and the important nature of the foot in dynamic movement.
Well, you mentioned it, so I'm going to ask you to expound on it a little bit, because yoga, of course, is connection. And I know you work with a lot of yogis, but I have also heard you connect things that I'm going to ask you to kind of just revisit and talk about. And I think it can be fascial and muscular and all of those. But one is, I'm going to say three of them, and then you can talk about them individually or together. But one of them is the big toe to the butt. You connect those. I've heard you connect the feet to the pelvic floor, which you did a little bit right now. And I've also heard you connect, I think it's the big toe, but certainly the toes to the tongue. And I don't think it is simply a fascial connection. I think it's a communication and a kind of a, I want to say like a central system of movement, kind of like a control center, but I might have that wrong. So
yeah, so those are three powerful connections. And honestly, I could speak about them biomechanically, fascially, or sensorially, because that's really every layer. Those three layers are built into every function or feature that we see within the foot and the foot's connection to the rest of the body. Now, the big toe to the butt or to the glutes, one, I could say that's based off of the pelvic floor stabilization, which is the foot to core. So the foot to core deep front line, which is your toe flexors, which is the function of your toe flexors is that they anchor, they pull you into the ground. So when you pull your toes into the ground, you activate your deep front line, which goes into your pelvic floor, foot to core stabilization. And for the listeners, a fun fact is that it's actually your posterior pelvic floor that it runs into versus the anterior. So it's more in that posterior side. Now, your glutes are only as strong as your pelvis is stable. So when I look at optimizing glute function, I need to look at foot to core or the deep front line. That's a way that you can think of this connection. Now, another way that you could look at the big toe to the glutes has to do with bipedalism and more mechanical range of motion of these joints. So if your first MPJ or your big toe does not have sufficient range of motion in it, when you walk, you'll not be able to take these long steps. And when we shorten our step length, you minimize hip extension. Hip extension is part of what drives glute activation, but you also are not triggering the pelvic floor. So in order to activate the pelvic floor, we have to take long steps. It's part of the stretch activation of the pelvic floor. So it's not as simple as saying, okay, I don't have big toe range of motion. I don't extend my hip. Therefore I get, deactivation of the glutes. It always kind of goes into a little bit deeper of like, hey, what's also happening to the pelvic floor stabilizers, and they're affected as well. The toe to tongue is really an extension of foot to core, and your long flexors go into that pelvic floor, into the diaphragm, up the neck, and then the tongue. So tongue position or tongue tension is really important to central stabilization, or I call it your soft tissue skeleton. So your soft tissue skeleton is really the internal fascia, which you could say runs through the GI system, but now we could then go into like interoception and visceral fascia. And it can kind of like keep evolving.
a wormhole.
It is a total wormhole. There is one last piece that I do want to mention, and there is a muscle synergy, and this has been demonstrated on fMRI. And what they saw is that when you activate your big toe flexor, so not all the digits, but your flexor hallucis longus, there is a co-activation in the posterior pelvic floor. And it is a muscle synergy that was demonstrated by fMRI of the brain. So that is showing that not only is it a fascial line, but we have a co-contracted muscle synergy that is also within the neuromuscular system. And the more that you kind of go down these wormholes or uncover that deep integrated nature, to me, it just keeps further validating that the purpose of our nervous system is movement and really longevity, because we mentioned that at the beginning.
Yeah.
To me, the secret of longevity is movement. You have to move to optimize all aspects of longevity. And it's such a powerful aspect of it. And we want that movement to be optimized, fascial, integrated, of a certain pace. So when people walk, I need them to walk fast enough, because it is fast walking with long steps that activates all of these stabilization systems. But what also activates our circulatory pumps, what gets good, healthy oxygen to the brain to support the cognitive function, your immune system, your lymphatic system. So it's so powerfully integrated.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I've seen so many studies about the gait cycle and longevity, and how a threat to longevity is when the gait shortens, when we can't walk fast, when we start shifting side to side, when there's a horizontal thing. And what you're saying is this is all coming back to that connection. It's not just about your quads. It really is
Exactly.
more complicated. Walking is way more complicated. And the function of even our toes is more complicated than we might imagine.
Yeah. And powerfully influential. I mean, and that's why, like, when you think of a child learning to walk, it is the movement of that child that unlocks language, learning, independence, emotion. Like, it's so powerful. And I love to look at movement and bipedalism as we go through newborn to then kind of the decline at the end, or say like chronic neurological conditions, and how we go through that journey, and how the decline of bipedalism has compounding effects on health, quality of life, cognition, right? So honestly, that's my secret to longevity, is just keep
But that's
moving.
not, tell me if I'm wrong, but that's not necessary. And so one of the things I think you are promoting in your work with the longevity thing is that decline, there is a lot of control in our ability to, we can't stop it. We know that some aspects of aging are there, but we can mitigate or manage, and that's the longevity piece, I think. How do we translate that though into so these theories are making me feel smart just listening to you, but not really. But how do we translate that into practice, like things that we can do if we know those things, if we know those connections? How do we work with them to make ourselves stay more on the range of functional movement, healthy gait?
Yeah, 100%. So I see all of the listeners and yoga practitioners as then the messenger or the educator to their students, that the student needs to see the applicable benefit of what they're doing in the practice and how it translates to everyday movement, bipedalism, longevity, right? That as we stand in a certain pose, tree pose will just be the easiest one to use, is what can you extrapolate from that, from a stabilization strategy that translates to mid stance when we walk, and then have the student understand that. So, okay, as you're balancing in tree pose, be aware of the digits, keeping the digits, long and extended. Feel the ground and engage the distal aspect or the tips of the toes when you're standing in tree pose, not just so you can hold the pose, but by you doing this pose and consciously activating the foot to core stabilization mechanism, you are strengthening it, you are reinforcing it. So now when you leave the studio or wherever they're practicing, that strength will translate to when you put on your shoes and you go out, so that they understand that there's a benefit that far exceeds that pose. I think that that's an important part of it. And when someone does have balance issues or a movement disorder, is to then further help them and say, you can use these and take this little pearl or this nugget that I'm giving you so you can hold the tree pose, but take that and I want you to incorporate this first thing when you wake up in the morning, right? Can you do like a mini tree pose and like balance every morning to activate the feet, things like that you can carry it into their day-to-day practice.
Now, very rarely teach a static tree pose because, and I teach every day, but I very rarely teach a static tree pose because we rarely stand on one leg. My favorite New Yorker cartoon one of my students sent me was a picture of a teacher in the front of the room standing in tree pose and said, now this pose is really useful for those times when you're standing on one leg with your other leg at your knee. But what I like to do, and I want to hear your opinion of that, is even if we're doing a tree pose, we're moving. Because I feel like I need not just my feet, but the whole system. The thing about balance, the tree pose static is good isometrically, but dynamically, if we're moving, we are actually talking to the whole neuromuscular system. That's my theory. I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so I actually think a good analogy of the tree pose and the moving is that I will tell when I teach balance classes that to be like a tree versus a flagpole, and trees technically move in the wind, right? They sway.
Exactly.
So there's a subtle movement or fluidity to them. So what I would potentially encourage as like a way to play with it for the students is to not be like a statue. So maybe that would be a better analogy, is like you're not a statue, but like flow with the movement. Part of the movement of you swaying subtly in tree pose is one that is constantly talking to your nervous system, because you are weight shifting pressure under the foot, which feeds the mechanoceptors. You are stimulating the fascial system, which has proprioceptors, right? And part of what is feeding the sway of the tree pose is our breath. So every time you breathe, you essentially sway, and then just gravity, right? So those are natural waves within it. And having the student understand that that is actually normal and that's easier. So like one quick analogy on this is I do aerials on the side, and a lot of like aerials is like hand balancing and kind of gymnastics. And I was a gymnast for 13 years, which is why I love body weight movements. So a big part of hand balancing is you're not ever like a statue. Imagine someone on hand balancing blocks and like Cirque du Soleil, where they're just beyond talented. They're constantly, they feel safe and comfortable in the fluidity of that balance, and they are listening to the body and auto adjusting in a calm way. They're keeping calm as they're there, where the tendency for a lot of people, especially as we start to lose our balance or we have neuropathy or something, is to kind of, you're trying to control the situation too much, and you become very stiff and aggressive and almost anxious in it, versus I'm here, I'm in the pose, I could be here 5 hours if I wanted, right? And you're just flowing with the gravity and the fascial system. So hopefully that helps the listeners in some way, but I used that.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely concept, and the thing of becoming one with the block that you're balancing on, or yeah. I think you did mention, I just want to ask one more thing. I don't want to take too much of your time, although I would love to pick your brain for like an hour and a half. You did mention the breath, and I think there's a connection. We are all about the breath, as you know, in the yoga world, but there's a connection between the feet and the diaphragm, the whole respiratory function. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yes. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't want people to think I forgot about it. But yes, there is a connection between your feet, pelvic floor, and then technically it's the continuity of the pelvic floor into the diaphragm. And then that is what continues up into the tongue. So when I teach foot to core stabilization, I actually guide it with the breath. And I often say that the breath is the driver to stability or stabilization. So how do you dance with the breath? How do you use the breath in coordination with how we're going to activate our feet? Oftentimes when I teach what's called short foot, or kind of the foot activation of the deep front line, I will coordinate that the foot contraction occurs with the exhalation. And in yoga, I know you have your bandhas, that you are essentially stacking the bandhas or the domes, and that is playing with toes down, causes an arch to lift. The pelvic floor lifts, you exhale, obviously your diaphragm is lifting, and then the tongue to the palate would be another dome that you're stacking. But again, I try to have it in a very relaxed way when I teach it. That's how I teach it, is that the breath is what's leading the stabilization. And in my practice, I focus a lot on the exhalation, and I have the inhalation be a reaction to the exhalation. I mean, inherently, if you exhale, your reflexes to inhale after that, right? So I try to bring the attention into the exhalation. And then, of course, we know all the amazing benefits of the parasympathetic and the vagus benefit to the exhalation side. So that's how I try to cue in breath with foot to core stabilization.
I think it's super exciting, though, to tie the autonomic nervous system in with your feet, and just to go through that whole connection idea. Now, we're very lucky because you're going to be teaching a 3-part course for us on foot function and fascial stabilization. So you'll be covering some of these topics. Can you talk a little bit about the course and what you will cover? I'm sure some of what we talked about, but probably a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to be tying in foot function from a fascial and sensorial perspective in how we stabilize, and then how that translates to dynamic movement. And I'll be looking at the gait cycle, the requirements, the stabilization and the energy transfer requirements of bipedalism, and then how I tie that into foot activation techniques, foot stabilization techniques, how I like to teach people to optimize those slings. And then if we do see a little bit of restriction in one of our students, I go into how I like to release and mobilize to open up those different areas in the body. So it'll be a great introductory course. If someone has not taken that dive into the foot, then this will really show the power of simple cueing. Maybe if you do already reference the foot and you're familiar with the fascial slings, I give a lot of fun little facts in there. So hopefully there's like a couple nuggets that every person will get out of it that they can then take into their practice, and then just further help those students in their day-to-day movement and their longevity.
Awesome. And there's a practice. So you do lead a practice.
Yes, I do.
We do in all our 3-part courses, but it's especially going to be useful for people who haven't been diving into the foot as its own entity versus keep your knee over your foot.
100%. And sometimes the way that I teach it may be a little bit different than how people have had it in the past. So I hope that it is something new and fresh and easily applicable to all the listeners.
Well, Dr. Emily, this has been fascinating, but of course I love this topic. So, but you've made it really, I guess so. Are you having more fun doing this or cutting people's feet open?
Definitely moving. Yes.
Well, I'm looking forward to your course, and thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you later. We'll see everybody later, hopefully in your class. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.